10 years ago, James and Evelyn decided their family was complete. 3 kids were enough. They had built a full and bustling household, alive with laughter, milestones, and the everyday chaos of family life. To make sure they wouldn't have more kids, James got a vasectomy when their youngest had just started kindergarten, their joint declaration that this chapter of their lives was complete. For a time, life felt like a dream. With their children growing into independent young people, James and Evelyn found themselves in a beautiful season of rediscovery. They had weathered the storms of late-night feedings, school drop-offs, and the constant demands of parenting. Now they had time to focus on each other again. They traveled to places they had only dreamed of in their younger years, found joy in quiet evenings together, and rekindled the bond that had carried them through the highs and lows of life. Their partnership was strong, their future bright. They were, by all accounts, content. But life, as they would soon learn, doesn't always stick to the plan. It started subtly. Evelyn would wake up feeling unusually tired, and then there was the unsettling dizzy spells. At first, Evelyn shrugged it off. She was in her mid-40s, and menopause seemed like the most logical explanation. After all, many of her friends were beginning to share their own experiences with odd flashes and fatigue. She had even laughed with James about the telltale signs creeping into their lives, a reminder of the passage of time. But as the weeks wore on, Evelyn couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. Her body wasn't just aging, it was behaving unpredictably. A sinking fear began to take root in her mind, one she couldn't quite articulate. She scheduled an appointment with her doctor, hoping for clarity and reassurance. When Evelyn visited her doctor to find out what was wrong, she had prepared herself for a conversation about hormone levels, perhaps a prescription to ease her symptoms. But the expression on the doctor's face stopped her cold. "Evelyn," the doctor began. Her tone was very careful. "Your blood work came back, and I have some news you might find surprising." Evelyn felt her pulse getting faster. "What is it?" "You are pregnant." The words landed like a thunderclap, vibrating in her ears as she struggled to process them. She blinked, certain she must have misheard the doctor. "That's not possible," she said. "My husband, he had a vasectomy 10 years ago." The doctor nodded sympathetically. Vasectomies are highly effective, but no method is 100%. There is a very small chance of failure, even years later. Evelyn's mind spiraled into a storm of disbelief and panic. This wasn't part of the plan. They had closed that chapter. How could this have happened? What would James say? Her thoughts collided with fear, confusion, and guilt, though she couldn't pinpoint why she felt guilty. After all, she couldn't get herself pregnant. The drive home felt like the longest drive ever. By the time she pulled into their driveway, her head was pounding and her chest felt tight. She sat in the car for a moment, staring at the house that had been her sanctuary for years. Inside, she knew James was waiting, oblivious to the bombshell she was about to drop. As she walked through the door, James greeted her with his usual warm smile. He was seated at the kitchen table, flipping through the mail, a cup of coffee steaming beside him. "How did the appointment go?" he asked casually, not even looking up. Evelyn hesitated. Her throat felt dry, and for a moment she considered not telling him at all. But that wasn't who they were. They had built their relationship on honesty, hadn't they? She took a deep breath and stepped into the kitchen, her voice trembling. "James," she said, her hands gripping the edge of the counter, "we need to talk." His eyes lifted to meet hers at the seriousness in her tone. "What is it? Is everything okay?" She bit her lip, searching for the right words. I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was deafening. James stared at her, his expression frozen in disbelief. He blinked once, twice, then leaned back in his chair, his hand dropping to his sides. "No," he finally said. "That's not possible." I know. It's shocking," Evelyn said quickly, her voice rising with urgency. "I felt the same way, but I've seen the doctor, James. The test is positive. There is no mistake." James's expression hardened, the disbelief in his eyes shifting into something colder. If you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe to the channel. Let's continue. "I had a vasectomy, Evelyn. You know that. So tell me, how is this possible?" Evelyn felt the sting of his words like a slap. "The doctor said it's rare, but vasectomies can fail." His laughter was bitter and sharp. "Fail? After 10 years? Do you really expect me to believe that?" Her heart sank as she realized where this was headed. "James, I would never." "Don't," he interrupted, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't tell me what you would or wouldn't do. The only explanation is that you cheated." Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes at the weight of his accusation hit her. "How dare you," she said, her voice breaking. "How could you even think that of me?" But James was already on his feet, pacing the kitchen like a caged animal. His words, sharp and cutting, left no room for doubt. He didn't believe her. "I want a paternity test," he said finally. His voice was cold and final. "When this baby is born, I want to prove it's mine." Evelyn's world crumbled around her as the man she had loved and trusted for decades turned his back on her in the moment she needed him most. The months that followed James's departure were the darkest of Evelyn's life. The day he packed his bags and left their home played on a loop in her mind, each moment etched in her memory like a scar. She had begged him to stay, to trust her, but his face remained a mask of anger and betrayal. His final words still haunted her. "I can't live like this, Evelyn, not with these doubts." Now, their once vibrant home felt cold and empty. The laughter of their 3 children, which had always been the soundtrack of their lives, had been replaced by a tense and painful silence. Evelyn moved through the days like a shadow, her heart weighed down by the enormity of what she had lost. Her pregnancy, which should have been a time of joy and anticipation, was marred by isolation and despair. Evelyn's health began to decline under the strain. She had always been a fighter, managing chronic health issues with resilience and grace. But the added stress of her situation made everything harder. The fatigue was relentless, the nausea more intense than she had experienced with her previous pregnancies. Her body ached, her spirit felt broken, and she often lay awake at night, her hand resting on her growing belly, whispering soft reassurances to the child within her. "It's not your fault, baby," she would murmur. "You are innocent in all of this." Her children, now teenagers, were caught in the crossfire of their parents' fractured relationship. They were old enough to sense the tension, but too young to fully understand. Her eldest, Liam, tried to be the man of the house, offering to help with chores and watching over his younger siblings. But Evelyn could see the pain in his eyes, the way he retreated to his room more often than before. "Why did Dad leave?" her middle child Anna asked one night. The question hung in the air, sharp and piercing. Evelyn struggled for an answer that wouldn't shatter their world further. "Your dad and I, We are going through a tough time right now, she said carefully, forcing a smile. But we both love you very much. That hasn't changed. It wasn't enough. She could see the confusion and hurt in their faces, and it broke her heart. Every day, Evelyn clung to the fragile hope that James would come around. She replayed their last argument in her mind, searching for a way she could have convinced him to stay. She composed countless unsent messages, drafting apologies she didn't owe, and explanation he wouldn't hear. Despite everything, she still loved him, and she believed that deep down he loved her too. But James remained distant. He called occasionally to check on the kids, but avoided any meaningful conversation. When he did speak to her, his tone was clipped, businesslike, as though she were no longer the woman he had once adored, but a stranger he had to tolerate. Each call ended with the same chilling reminder: "I'll be there for the paternity test when the baby is born." Those words cut deeper each time he said them, a cruel echo of his refusal to trust her. It was as though he had erased the years they had spent building a life together, the vows they had exchanged, the love they had shared. The loneliness was suffocating. Evelyn often found herself sitting in the nursery she had reluctantly begun to prepare. She imagined what life would be like if things were different. If James were there with her, his hand on her belly, laughing as they picked out baby names together. Instead, she faced each decision alone, the weight of his absence pressing down on her like a stone. Her family and friends tried to support her, but even their well-meaning words felt hollow. "Give him time," they said. "He'll come around." But as the weeks turned into months, it became clear that James wasn't coming back, not unless she could prove her innocence. The realization was like a dagger to her heart. She had always believed that their love was unshakable, but now she saw that James' doubt had fractured something fundamental between them. She began to wonder if proving her innocence would even matter, because the trust that had once defined their relationship seemed irrevocably broken. Evelyn resolved to keep moving forward, not because she felt strong, but because she had no other choice. For her children, for her unborn baby, and for herself, she had to survive. Each day was a battle, but she fought it with quiet determination, knowing that the darkest night would eventually give way to dawn. But whether the dawn would bring healing or more heartache, she couldn't see that yet. The baby, a girl she named Grace, was born on a chilly autumn morning. Inside, Evelyn lay exhausted but radiant, cradling her tiny daughter in her arms. Grace's cry had been strong and insistent, a sound that filled the sterile delivery room with life and hope. Evelyn gazed down at her heart swelling with a bittersweet mixture of love and sorrow. Tears streamed down her face as she traced the delicate features of her newborn. The perfect little nose, the tiny hands curling into fists, the softness of her skin. This should have been a moment of joy, but it was overshadowed by a deep aching void. James wasn't there. He hadn't been there through the labor, hadn't held her hand or whispered reassurances when the pain became overwhelming. His absence was deeply felt. Evelyn whispered softly to Grace, "You are here now, my little miracle, and no matter what happens, I will love you with everything I have." A week later, the day of the DNA test arrived. The air was heavy with unspoken tension as Evelyn sat in the waiting room, Grace nestled in her arms. James arrived shortly after. His steps were hesitant, and his face was like a mask of stoic detachment. He avoided her gaze as he took a seat across the room. It was the first time they had been in the same space in months, but the silence between them was deafening. Evelyn's heart ached at the sight of him. He looked older, wearier, as though the months of separation had taken a toll on him too. But she couldn't bring herself to feel pity, not after what he had put her through. The procedure itself was quick and clinical. A nurse gently swabbed Grace's tiny cheek, then took samples from Evelyn and James. The entire time, James remained silent and Evelyn held Grace close. The result came back a few days later. James had insisted on being present when the envelope was opened, and Evelyn agreed, if only to finally put an end to the accusations that had haunted her. They sat in a small office, the doctor between them. Grace lay peacefully in a bassinet nearby, oblivious to the storm surrounding her. The doctor unfolded the paper, his expression neutral as he read aloud. The test confirms that James is the biological father. If you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe to the channel. Let's continue. Evelyn closed her eyes, a wave of relief washing over her, but it was tinged with bitterness. She turned to look at James, who sat frozen, his face pale and his lips parted slightly. I didn't know, James stammered, his voice barely audible. He looked at her, his eyes wide with something that resembled regret. The doctor said the vasectomy was permanent, Evelyn. Evelyn's voice was cold, her anger sharp as glass. There is always a small chance it can fail, James. I told you, but you didn't listen. You did not believe me. You did not believe us. James flinched at her words. He opened his mouth to speak, but Evelyn wasn't finished. Do you have any idea what you put me through? She continued, her voice trembling with the weight of the months of isolation and pain. I carried our child alone, James. I battled my own health issues, raised our other kids, and endured your absence because you couldn't even trust me. I'm sorry, he said, his voice breaking. I was scared. I didn't know how else to handle it. Scared? Evelyn repeated, her tone incredulous. We were supposed to face things together. That's what marriage is. But instead, you abandoned me. James reached for her hand, but she pulled away. Evelyn, I'm sorry, he said again, desperation creeping into his voice. I made a mistake. I see that now, and I want to fix this. But Evelyn shook her head, her expression resolute. Some things can't be fixed, James. Trust isn't something you can rebuild overnight. It's earned, and you destroyed it. Though they maintain a facade of cordiality for the sake of the children, the marriage between James and Evelyn was fractured. The trust that once formed the bedrock of their relationship had crumbled, leaving behind a gap too wide to bridge. After months of strained conversation and unspoken resentments, James packed his belongings and moved into a small apartment across town. The family home that was once filled with shared memories and laughter became Evelyn's sole domain, a place where she would rebuild her life from the wreckage. Some stories don't end in reconciliation, but with growth. For James, the experience was a painful lesson in the fragility of relationships and the irreparable damage that mistrust could cause. Evelyn threw herself into her role as a mother and professional, channeling her heartbreak into productivity. Her days were a blur of packed lunches, school drop-offs, bedtime stories, and late-night work sessions. But in the quiet moments, when the children were asleep, the weight of her loneliness pressed down on her. There were nights she sat at the kitchen table, staring at the spot where James used to drink his morning coffee, and wondered if she could ever truly move on. The older children, though still getting used to the changes in their family, found themselves doting on their baby sister. Grace became the glue that subtly held them all together, her innocence and joy offering a respite from the tension that lingered beneath the surface. And for Grace, her story would forever be intertwined with the complexities of love and family. She was a child born into a fractured but deeply caring home. While her parents' bond could not be mended, their love for her and her siblings remained steadfast, a reminder that even broken hearts can find ways to nurture and endure. If you have enjoyed this story, please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.